There's been lots of tough talk aimed at China and its refusal to let the yuan get stronger. There's even been a bill that would penalize the Chinese for being a currency manipulator. But the latest perspective comes from Martin Wolf of the Financial Times. His new column is headlined, "Why America is Going to Win the Global Currency Battle," and he joins us now from London. Martin, this doesn't have anything to do with trade penalties. Explain.
Well, this particular argument is quite simple. I think the argument in the United States, above all in the Fed, is moving strongly in the direction of viewing deflation as the greatest threat. Therefore, we can expect further aggressive monetary action by the Fed, quantitative easing. This is in the context in which the private sector of the world is no longer going into the dollar as the safe haven. So the dollar in this context is going to weaken a great deal against every currency. And this gives all the rest of the world a terrible headache. They have to decide either to float upwards and lose competitiveness against the US or intervene, which risks creating inflation. The Chinese will clearly intervene. A lot of the others are just going to go upwards. They will try capital controls, won't work, and the net effect will be a strong stimulation in the rest of the world, and that's exactly what the United States wants.
So it's not exactly a war of attrition. It's almost by accident that in its effort to tackle the deflationary pressure, the Fed would succeed in, as you say, winning the currency war.
Well, there are dangers here, but there's been a long history of this. A weak dollar and a weak U.S. economy is very expansionary for the rest of the world, and above all, tends to be very inflationary for the rest of the world, which is why the rest of the world doesn't like it. But I think that's absolutely where we are now as a byproduct of this concern in the U.S. and the indifference to the external value of the dollar, which we know from history that's exactly the effect we're going to get. And China will, of course, go with the U.S., and that is going to make China very unpopular with other countries, both emerging countries and other developed countries.
Martin, the Fed doesn't exactly like to see itself as an agent in these currency wars. You made some very cogent arguments heading into the IMF for things that the U.S. might do instead of trade penalties. The IMF didn't resolve any of this. Do you have any confidence that anyone is listening to these perhaps more sane alternatives?
Well, the alternatives that are being discussed is that we would insist with the Chinese in particular that they couldn't buy our assets, or in this case American assets, financial assets, if they didn't open up their own capital markets to foreign purchases of their assets. China, is, of course, has a pretty closed capital account on the inflow side. That there, in other words, there will be reciprocity. I think that's a very reasonable proposal, and in the absence of that, there could be penalties on China's purchases of U.S. financial assets, and so it will be a capital account war rather than a trade war, as it were. Others are suggesting the U.S. should actually go out and buy proxies for the renminbi, basically making it more difficult for the Chinese to manage their own currency. This is, again, very difficult as long as China maintains exchange controls. How effective these instruments will be, we don't know, but clearly they would put a lot of pressure on China.
Martin, we only have about 30 seconds left. Reciprocity, reasonable, but is it realistic?
I think that's a very reasonable question. I put forward the idea because it's now being under discussion. Some say it's unworkable. It would involve certainly policing Chinese ownership of US dollar assets in a very intrusive way. But you have to accept that China is pursuing a very non-reciprocal policy with dramatically deleterious effects on other countries.
Well, Martin, thank you for joining us this morning. And please keep writing about this fascinating standoff between the U.S. and China. Martin Wolf of the Financial Times with us from London.